Some real live drama.
He was a very complex guy.
That's Melina Brown, Himan Brown's granddaughter and the keeper of his artistic legacy.
He was proud of his legacy, and I think he wanted you to know that he'd done a lot in his life, that there was a bigness to him.
And that's Zach Sanstead, Brown's great-grandson, a filmmaker. On this episode of Audio Maverick, we open a portal into the other side of Brown's life, his family. I'm Margot Avery. Stay tuned.
Come in.
Oh, very good.
Himan Brown's private life reveals a man of contradictions. A generous man, but only on his own terms. A workaholic who nonetheless is remembered by his grandchildren as a lovable presence at their birthday parties. A coupon-cutting millionaire, unable to get free of his Depression-era upbringing. As a creative force, Himan Brown was unique, but as a successful businessman and dynastic head of an extensive family, he was something of an archetype. The kind of character who might appear in The Great Gatsby or Citizen Kane, a wealthy, driven man surrounded by colleagues and family, but sometimes emotionally isolated. And there's a sense in which Brown remains an enigma. In most biographies, facts are used to tell a story. But Brown's family history is fragmented, so to some extent we must use personal stories and recollections to uncover facts.
I am Melina Brown, and I'm Himan Brown's granddaughter.
To piece together who Brown was to his family and understand his private life, we spoke at length with his granddaughter, Melina Brown, a philanthropist, producer, and activist. She is the daughter of Barry Brown, Hyman's son from his first marriage to Mildred Geller in 1933. As we learned in our second episode, Sam and Dora Brown raised their children in their Brownsville neighborhood. They included Brown's brothers, Nate and Mendy, and Himan and Mildred lived briefly with his parents after a marriage overshadowed by current events.
The day he came back from his honeymoon with my grandmother, his first wife, they closed the banks.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be.
Melina Brown thinks this Depression-era start to domestic life shaped Brown's character, and not just as a creative force, the guise in which we best know him.
He did very well financially. I'm not sure if most of that wasn't from fear.
The couple started their own family early in Brown's career. He was famously on a train to Chicago to close his deal to turn the syndicated cartoon strip Dick Tracy into a radio series at the birth of his first child. And this, too, seems prophetic. He evolved as a patriarch, but not so easily as a family man.
He was hardly home. I mean, it was a 30-year marriage, but their marriage was a little difficult. She really tried to please him and make herself smarter and and she wanted to be a writer and go to school, but, she just thought maybe she wasn't that smart, and she was a blonde bombshell.
One who wanted to better herself, apparently. But Mildred also followed the more traditional course of housewives of that era, a display of upward mobility.
She wanted this fancy place on the Upper West Side, and she wanted maids, and his rent was like $300 a month in this 13-room apartment overlooking the reservoir. And it sounds very inexpensive now, but that was really high rent back then.
The Browns' former Central Park West apartment building is home to all kinds of A-list residents. Kevin Bacon, all 6 degrees of him, was a neighbor during Brown's tenure. And so it's not exactly the kind of place you can just stroll into. So we can't explore it as we have with other sites that helped to shape Brown's story. But we can at least get a sense of what it represented: material ease and lavishness. It dates from 1906, the year of Reginald Fessenden's pioneering radio broadcast, and it looks like a vast stone wedding cake. Eventually, it housed Brown's extensive collection of paintings. Melina Brown, her son Will, and Zach Sanstead all remember the collection as dominating the extensive apartment. As they describe it, it sounds like the Henry Clay Frick Museum on Fifth Avenue, the former old mansion of the 19th century industrialist and collector.
Yeah, like every wall of his apartment covered in paintings.
That's Zach Sanstead.
I believe curated to be grouped by era and painter. His sitting room where he would sit and talk with you or, hold court.
Will Brown saw it as a showcase of Himan Brown's artistic taste. It included the sort of shrewd acquisitions you'd expect: old masters, there was a Rembrandt, and contemporary ones like Picasso, whom he liked. But also works by friends. Zach Sanstead remembers a compelling still life by Elia Kazan, which is now owned by Sansted's mother, Barry.
Which is a beautiful painting of a fisherman in a brown oil-slicked jacket. He's holding a fish, like a small silver fish, like a herring, and a boning knife in the other hand. He looks kind of at you, kind of into the middle distance. It's impressionist, but still figurative. It's a very affecting piece.
Brown's investment in properties didn't end with his own homes. He had a number of other residences around the city, buildings he invested in, both for himself and his extended family. Real estate reflected Brown's somewhat conflicted relationship with his family.
Himan kept everyone compartmentalized also. It's very strange. Like, he just felt like everyone was on him for money.
Sometimes it was hard for Brown not to see things through the filter of fiscal anxiety.
He never would really look at it, but he did have some OCD about money and a lot of fear around it. But I think that he just was always worried, and he felt very responsible for the whole family, and he loved us quite a bit.
Brown was especially generous about medical expenses, and education was an important focus. He supported his grandchildren's school and college expenses, and there wasn't an age barrier to his largesse. Zach Sanstead credits him with changing his father's life well after school age.
When I was born, my dad was a nurse, and Hyman paid for him to go back to school and to go to law school to get a better kind of job and provide for us better, which is a thing I think Hyman had always wanted, right? He'd always wanted a boy of some kind to invest in and to reflect back at him.
Melina's father, Barry, didn't entirely fill that role. He was the classic prodigal son, ambitious but also a big spender. He was a successful commercial director, but Melina Brown notes he found it soul-sucking. He really wanted to make it in movies, but when various projects fell through, Brown offered him an audio legacy.
He never made it in movies. My grandfather wanted him to work, so at a certain point he started to hand him these properties.
Which meant giving Barry an opportunity to license and market them. Among them was Brown's most successful property, Inner Sanctum.
Palmolive Brushless and Palmolive Lather Shaving Cream present Inner Sanctum Mysteries.
And Brown had the same approach to helping his brother Mendy. They, too, had an uneasy relationship.
Mendy finally moved to Australia with his family, and so Hyman just gave him the rights to Inner Sanctum in Australia. So he was, in his mind, helping people out, trying to find ways not to give them money, even though he had so much money.
In this context, at least, Himan Brown's largesse seems like a character test. The idea being that Brown would provide an asset, and if the recipient had the resources to develop it, they would succeed.
He just wanted everyone to be working.
And Will Brown tells us he did not want anyone to feel like some entitled industry heir. Melina and her sister Barry got their opportunity at a slightly less exalted level, answering fan mail at the Chelsea studio. They were cherished grandchildren, to be sure, the ones allowed to use the corridors as a speedway. But Melina Brown feels her grandfather wasn't quite as focused on shaping the careers of the women in his family.
He could talk a good game in public about women and whatever, but when it came down to it, like in his family, he wanted his son. And if his son couldn't run things, it kind of left him open. But then with me, towards the end, he finally said to me, "Wow, you're really smart." And he just started heaping more responsibility on me. And it took like a whole lifetime.
Brown had challenging relationships with his siblings and children and was estranged from Melina Brown's father, Barry, at the time of his death. But the grandchildren got to experience a less driven, softer Brown.
He was pretty horrible to his own kids, and then he sort of mellowed as he got older, and then he loved us from the time we were born.
As a grandfather, Brown was a star attraction. He made guest appearances at Melina and Barry's schools, and when they came to the Chelsea studios as children, there was an important ritual.
He used to keep matzahs and margarine in his mid-century modern cabinet, and when we'd come, he'd make us each a matzah with margarine and salt.
Brown was the reigning figure at all family birthday parties, and Melina and Will Brown remember children clamoring all over him.
I mean, the kids would play with him and on him, like drive cars on him and stuff.
On the other hand, Zach Sanstead found Brown a bit intimidating.
He always sat at the head of the table. You know, he's the patriarch.
And Depression-era anxiety would sometimes surface even in the midst of celebrations.
In a very Great Depression style, he would cut paper-thin slices of cake, where he could make a small Carvel cake serve 30, 40 people.
The stinginess that Brown's CBS Mystery Theater actors found endearing was a source of puzzlement and frustration to his family, and surfaced in every aspect of his life. Cars.
He had an older model brown car, clearly had gotten it for cheap at some point, an undesirable color. An older model. He definitely could afford a nice new car.
And clothes.
He knew Cy Sims.
An off-price clothing magnate.
And he wore these really natty wedding shoes. There was like a wedding store where you could rent tuxes closing down on Broadway or something. And he went in and he bought them out of everything. These shoes, he loved them. So he had so many, and he had had them for 50 years. But that was the great deal, that he had a whole closet full of these things.
Including paisley tuxedos, which Melina Brown has kept.
A velvet paisley tux, things like that. And Shirley, of course, could get him designer clothes.
Shirley was Shirley Goodman, Brown's second wife, whom he married in 1970. She was executive vice president at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Though indirectly, Brown already had a connection in the fashion industry. Calvin Klein is a cousin on Mildred Geller's side. So Himan Brown's domestic life was marked by generosity and emotional complications, and by some of the traditional benchmarks of affluence, an elegant apartment, an important art collection, and in the 1940s, Brown purchased property in Stamford, Connecticut. Here's Melina Brown again.
The cottage was built in 1900, and the studio was built as a choral rehearsal hall for a church. And it had stained glass and everything, but that didn't come with the deal. And that was built in 1910. This is all just coming from Himan. I don't have any documents. He had, and I have somewhere, the canceled check. I think he paid $16,000 for this whole place.
The studio was somewhat separate from the main house and became Brown's creative domain in the country.
He had a studio that's a garage building, so he would stay there. That was his lair. When he moved up there, there was hardly anyone there. It was dirt roads. There was no one there. And now it's a very fancy area, but how could he have known? It just sort of fell into his lap that there was this piece of land with this little cottage on it.
And like Brown's Chelsea studio investment, also cheap and timely, Stamford began to pay dividends, but they were social ones.
A lot of writers and actors. Gene Wilder ended up living there. Kim Hunter was right up the street.
Brown's little cottage, now Melina Brown's home, is reached via the scenic Merritt Parkway, which was completed in 1938.
This was the excavation for the Merritt Parkway around 1938. Governor Cross opens the Merritt Parkway.
Zach Sanstead thinks it reflects a social pattern that his grandfather was part of.
The Merritt Parkway or the Taconic were built to be scenic. They were built to be beautiful, meandering highways for people to drive out of the city on, right, in a power brokery kind of way.
In fact, the Merritt was built to relieve traffic congestion, but the congestion itself was certainly part of a larger pattern of post-war upward mobility that Brown's ascent represented. It was evidence of the ability to get out of town and to have a pleasurable experience doing so.
I think we have this Great Gatsby image of driving through the ash heaps, and I don't think that's really the way it was. The beautiful ornate bridges and the meandering style. So many broad sweeping turns on the Merritt when there don't have to be. I think probably for the experience of turning your car along the turn and feeling the G-force, right? Like it's a very sensual highway.
In addition to the scenic drive and his family, Brown's arty neighbors added a kind of cachet to Brown's country life. But his greatest celebrity catch in private life was a tenant. The studio was frequently rented at one point to J.D. Salinger, author of the iconic coming-of-age novel Catcher in the Rye. Here's Melina Brown.
He would say, Jerry, very strange guy. But my father has memories of taking walks with him and that he had piles and piles of stuff. He was sort of a hoarder, and he had a big shaggy dog that would run around, and my father would take walks with him. And so, of course, I think like every man, he thought that Catcher in the Rye was written about him.
Melina Brown and her son Will moved into the Stanford house in the late 1990s.
Every single weekend, unless the roads were impassable because of snow, he would come up to Connecticut. He used to walk to this little country store that was exactly 1 mile up the road, reading scripts with a red pencil. So he never even looked up. I mean, he worked all the time, and he was editing scripts as he went. That was his way.
Brown had his work, but his demons followed him.
His father was a tailor, and he would strap his sewing machine to his back, and he would go through the streets yelling, dresses, repairs, whatever. And if he didn't make 25 cents in a day, they just wouldn't eat, or they'd just eat like a potato or something like that. And I think that that really traumatized him. I think that he also had some OCD, which could have come from trauma. And I found myself, like in his later years, saying, look around you. You have so much.
There was a tender twist to Brown's obsession about saving at all costs.
We'd go couponing together, and he had so many coupons, and he had all these yellowed, like no expiration date coupons. And he was like the old guy in the line who was holding everyone up, and they would owe him money at the end. He was such a good couponer. He was just so scared about, paying for groceries. By the end of it, I was just lying to him. I told him that everything at Zabar's went to half price. Like the nurses I was hiring, one of the first things was take the price tags off of everything. And they couldn't understand it. But then when they got to know him, they understood, because that's how he was. It's kind of sad.
But the irrepressible Himan Brown we've come to know and admire was still there.
We'd go to a hospital and he would be on the table and a doctor would come in and he'd say, I want to make a drama about doctors. Like, he had all these ideas. And everywhere we were, he was trying to sell a show. We couldn't go to the supermarket without him trying to sell a show.
It's wonderful to imagine what those shows might have been. There is no way in our brief narrative to encompass Brown's crowded late years. There was one last unsuccessful marriage, a busy lecture schedule, and birthday parties with his CBS Radio Mystery Theater Company.
I think it was really sweet that they would still try to keep up with taking him to Carmine's on Broadway on his birthday. That was Tony Roberts and all of them, as many of them as were in town and could come, and they'd get a big table and they'd take him. And he loved that.
By this time, of course, Brown is every inch his own man. We don't need to resort to comparisons to fabled moguls, fictional or real. But one celebrity provided a somewhat eccentric model.
Harry Houdini had a place up there, and he would come up on weekends just to work on the land because it helped him be creative and think of things. So I'd look out and see my grandfather dragging giant vines, and then he'd later come out of the woods.
Who knows what Houdini was thinking about in those moments, but we can probably guess what was on Himan Brown's mind. His abiding creative home, radio theater, from which he felt ultimately exiled. The times and the technology had moved past him.
His tagline was, from the crystal set to the internet. He couldn't really understand the internet. He couldn't get his brain past CDs. I think CDs were as far as he could go.
But in vision, in imagination, Himan Brown could go anywhere.
Oh, there's just so much more about him. You know, as far as career, he worked for his entire life to get back on the air.
Among Brown's many CBS Radio Mystery Theater productions were plays featuring Sherlock Holmes, an enduring character who bridges fiction and fact, because, as the poet Vincent Starrett writes, only those things the heart believes are true. Brown believed that radio drama was, in its essence, true, and the future proved him right. Up next, our final episode, Everything Old is New Again, where we meet Himan Brown's heirs to the world of audio theater.
Can you tell me about the work you do?
Like on tape? Because I already told you about it.
For the tapes, yes.
No,
I'm
I can't help you. I have a wife now, a whole new life.
And who do you think gave you that life?
If you're out there listening, I just want to say how sorry I am. I love that cat as much as you did.
The Ralphs. They would like to remind everyone that people are not allowed in the dog park.
I'm Margot Avery. Stay tuned. Audio Maverick is produced and directed by Sarah Montague, who also writes the scripts. Our executive producers are Melina Brown and Sarah Montague. CUNY TV's executive director is Chiqui Cartagena. The director of production is Susan Iger, and Deborah Labadie is CUNY TV's chief operating officer. The associate producer for Audio Maverick is Corinne Wallace, and our audio production intern is Lucia Funaro. Audio Maverick is narrated by Margot Avery. Our technical team at CUNY includes senior audio engineer Richard Kim and audio engineer and program mix engineer Lisa Goslin. Our staff photographer is Laura Fuchs. Our archivists are David Rice and Katrina Schlosser. Our closed caption coordinator is Amy Monty. And the script editor is Allison Berenger. Our theme was composed by Allison Leighton Brown. Sound design and final mixing are by John Delore and Bart Warshaw. Multitude Productions handles our publicity and marketing. Audio Maverick is a production of CUNY TV.